They burned the Grand Master alive. The crowds watched as Jacques de Molay vanished beneath the flame, and with him the last gasp of the most feared brotherhood in Christendom. Or so they thought. But across the hills of Auvergne, a rider was spotted, dressed in black marked with the cross, not red and white, black and blood. In the years that followed, more appeared, silent, disappearing as quickly as they came. They didn't chant or crusade. They didn't kneel. They watched, waited, and some say they never left. But let the fire die down now. Let the roar of execution give way to the soft rustle of old parchment and long-forgotten names. Because in the silence that followed the Templars' fall, something darker moved beneath the surface. You've heard of the Knights Templar warrior monks with iron discipline sworn to poverty, wielders of immense power and even greater secrets. You've heard the ending too, haven't you? Betrayed by a king, dismantled by a pope, erased by fire. It's a satisfying story, clean, finished. But history is rarely clean, and endings, more often than not, are illusions. Because buried in the margins of post-Templar Europe lie stories of another brotherhood, a secret continuation, an order that cast off the white mantle and returned draped in black. Whispers of a lineage that never died, only deepened. They weren't just survivors. They were shadows, observers, and sometimes architects. We'll follow their trail through vanished fleets, secret archives, battles rewritten, and symbols that re-emerge when no one's looking. Not all of them are obvious. Some leave marks only the initiated would see. But once you begin, you can't unsee them. And what you'll begin to wonder is, if they never truly disbanded, then what are they now? Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. The sun rose slowly over the Ile de la Cité that morning, as if reluctant to witness what was about to happen. Paris, still wrapped in fog and fear, gathered at the banks of the Seine to watch justice or vengeance unfold. On a small island flanked by gray water, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar stood defiant. Jacques de Molay, weary perhaps, but not broken, refused to confess to heresy one final time, and so without ceremony they set him alight. The fire consumed his flesh, but not his name. Witnesses would later whisper that his last words were not of repentance, but prophecy. He summoned King Philip and Pope Clement to stand before God within the year. Strangely or predictably, depending on your taste for dramatic timing, both men were dead by the end of 1314. But this wasn't just a grim tale of divine retribution. Something else stirred in the wake of that execution. Within weeks of the Grand Master's immolation, travelers passing through the forest roads of Auvergne and the hills of Champagne began speaking of strange sightings, riders cloaked in black faces obscured, moving with the confidence of military patrols, yet bearing no flag of any known lord. Some described a cross on their tunics, but unlike the proud red cross of the Templars, this one was darker sometimes, crimson, sometimes almost black, as if stained or shadowed. Most dismissed these as brigands or desperate Templar remnants seeking shelter. But the frequency of reports and their curious consistency caught the attention of regional abbots and even royal officers. A Dominican friar writing from Tours in late 1314 reported encountering men of the old order but clothed in mourning and without name. He was not heard from again. One might expect a swift crackdown, a renewed inquisition. But nothing came. The monarchy, it seemed, was more interested in claiming Templar land than hunting down ghosts. And the Church, having already declared the matter closed, showed little appetite to restoke the fires of scandal. Convenient, isn't it? Like a family pretending the body buried in the cellar is finally at peace, even as the boards above creak at night. It's tempting to interpret these sightings as isolated or symbolic, scattered former knights refusing to surrender the identity that once defined them. Yet scattered knights don't coordinate horse patrols through 3 provinces. They don't vanish as soon as they're spotted. And they certainly don't match insignias down to obscure regional heraldry that hadn't been used since the Crusades. One such account comes from a blacksmith's apprentice in Limoges, who swore under oath that a group of 5 armored men arrived at his forge late one evening offering silver for silence and requesting repairs to chainmail of a design not seen since Acre fell. They left before dawn. He found a strange seal impressed into the cooled ash near his hearth, a cross within a circle, and behind it a serpent curled inward. That symbol doesn't match any known Templar standard, but it does appear curiously in the margins of a 13th-century Templar ledger found in the preceptory at Gisors, one of the order's most infamous strongholds. The page bears no title, only annotations in Latin. One phrase repeats Nigrum lumen custodet the Black Light Guards. Now it could all be a fiction, a case of collective grief manifesting as legend. But history rarely creates ghosts unless it's trying to bury something deeper. If de Molay's death was the closing chapter, why do the pages keep turning? It's also worth noting that while Philip IV seized Templar lands with gusto, a curious exception was the region around La Rochelle, the order's key port and naval hub. Ships vanished. Fortresses stood empty. Records simply stopped. If the French crown truly believed the Templars extinguished, why station royal troops there for the next decade, not to guard relics, not to secure towns, but to watch the sea? In the decades that followed, rumors of a Black Order would echo faintly across Europe, a name never formally given, but often whispered with dread or awe. Sometimes they were seen at night, sometimes during war, sometimes simply walking among pilgrims unnoticed, except by the few who knew what to look for. A pause in gait, a glance exchanged, a ring turned inward on the finger, and the timing. Well, you might remember that only 2 years after de Molay burned, an oddly well-funded group of knights resurfaced in the Iberian Peninsula. They claimed no allegiance, wore no crest, but carried the discipline and tactics of men trained in the old ways. No one could quite say where they came from, or who paid them, but they fought as if possessed by something older than loyalty. Perhaps it was revenge, perhaps it was faith, or perhaps the death of the Templars was not an end, but a transformation. The white cloaks had burned, but beneath the ash, something darker was already rising. It was a fog-heavy morning in La Rochelle when the ships slipped away. The year was 1307. News of the Templar arrests had not yet reached every outpost, but tension was thick in the air. Something had changed. The wind tasted of betrayal. What happened next would become one of the most quietly persistent mysteries in the Order's long, tangled legacy. La Rochelle wasn't just any port. It was the Templars' naval jewel, a strategic harbor fortified with purpose tucked into the Atlantic coast, far from papal scrutiny and closer to the open sea than the king's justice. And in early October of that year, just days before Philip IV unleashed his coordinated assault on the Templar network, at least a dozen of the Order's ships disappeared. There were no official departure records, no merchant logs, no receipts of cargo. Just absence. Vessels that had docked days prior laden with grain, gold, or weapons were simply gone. Witnesses' dockhands mostly would later report night movements, hoods, crates, and whispered orders. One claimed to have seen a sealed chest moved onto a galley by men who spoke no French. Another described a banner not white but dark black with a faded red cross, stitched smaller than tradition allowed. It's easy to wave this away as confusion. Ports are chaotic. Ships come and go. But then why did royal agents arrive at La Rochelle barely a week later, furious, empty-handed, and visibly nervous? And why did the Vatican issue a quiet directive in early 1308, requesting all coastal bishops along the Bay of Biscay to report vessels bearing unusual insignia or manned by bearded men in martial attire? If the order had been shattered, who were they expecting? Some theories naturally drift toward the romantic. That the ships carried away treasure, the famed Templar gold, or perhaps relics far more sacred. But there's a quieter, more unsettling possibility that what these ships truly carried was not wealth, but continuity. You see, the Templars weren't merely a military order. They were logistical masters, bankers, map makers, builders of corridors and codes. To run an empire from Jerusalem to Edinburgh, you needed more than faith. You needed a contingency plan. And La Rochelle may well have been it. Historical records in the archives of a Spanish monastery reference a fleet of brothers who sail not under flag, but under silence. This phrase appears in a 14th century ledger beside an unusual symbol. A compass rose surrounded by 13 stars. No known Templar documents feature this constellation, but it does appear again carved crudely into a cellar wall beneath a defunct commandery in Bruges, along with the initials NM repeated 7 times. The initials have puzzled scholars for decades. One guess is nigrum militum, the same Latin phrase noted in obscure Vatican documents and echoed in the cryptic seal seen near Limoges. If so, the suggestion is chilling, that there was already a designation for a black order before the fires even started. One of the most curious tales comes from a Genoese logbook discovered in the mid-20th century. It recounts an encounter in 1311 between a merchant ship and a trio of long vessels bearing no national markings, manned by men robed darkly and pale of expression. They did not speak. They did not signal. But they shadowed the Genoese ship for 2 days, and on the third one came close enough for the captain to see a cross, carved into the prow with a serpent curled around it. When the logbook was reviewed by modern archivists, they noted the description bore resemblance to the symbol found in the Geysor's ledger, the same one linked to the black light. It is difficult to establish truth from fragments, of course, but the consistency is troubling. And more troubling still is the question no one asks: if they left, where did they go? Some say Scotland, hiding in plain sight among allies of the old Crusader families. Others point to Portugal, where the Order of Christ rose suspiciously fast, with familiar rites and familiar coffers. But the sea itself holds other answers. There are unconfirmed reports, not in journals, but oral history of islands in the Azores settled before they appeared on any official map. A place where brothers lived like monks, but rode like warriors. Even today, oceanographers exploring the Atlantic Ridge have discovered shipwrecks, wooden structures reinforced with iron nails of distinctly medieval French style, resting hundreds of miles west of La Rochelle. No one knows how they got there. And perhaps more importantly, no one has asked why they were going in that direction. The irony is, for all the obsession with the Templars' lost treasure, the greater mystery may be the treasure of memory. A brotherhood surviving not through gold, but through anonymity, through silence, through the art of becoming less seen. There's a modern term for it: going black. But the Templars, it seems, may have invented it. Long before radios, long before governments. They vanished, yes, but not into oblivion. They vanished into purpose. And if a fleet vanished once, what stops it from sailing again? white was the color of righteousness. At least that's what the order once believed. The Knights Templar were clothed in snowy mantles marked with a red cross so stark it seemed to bleed against the purity of their garb. It was more than a uniform, it was a message. A declaration of divine mission humility in service and blood pledged to a higher cause. But sometime after the order's collapse, the color changed. The earliest mentions are scattered and hushed. A priest in Poitiers wrote of visitors from the mountains who wore cloaks of deepest black with crimson threading around the edges. A tapestry fragment discovered in an abandoned priory near Lyon shows a knight kneeling in front of an altar, but his cloak isn't white. It's dark, faded, possibly black, and the cross, though present, is stitched in thread, barely visible, almost hidden within the folds. At first glance, it might seem like artistic license or monastic error, but as sightings and mentions of this altered attire accumulate, it becomes harder to explain away. Why would former knights exiled or hunted adopt a new color? Black was not a color associated with knighthood in the Latin West. It was traditionally a symbol of death, penitence, secrecy, or rejection. It had more in common with monastic robes than martial vestments. One theory holds that the black cloak was a sign of mourning, a somber nod to the fall of the order. Perhaps it began as protest, a visual dirge, but this fails to explain why the garments persisted well into the 15th century, evolving from tattered rags of exiles to sleek near-military garments with standardized tailoring and distinctive insignia. In an illuminated manuscript held in the Biblioteca Nazionale in Florence, a marginal note beside a crusade chronicle includes a curious comment. It describes an encounter with men once of the temple now cloaked in night, and references a ritual called ex tenebris lux, from darkness light. That phrase would become a whispered motto among secret fraternities and is still etched above the archway of a ruined Templar chapel in southern Italy. The symbolism, of course, invites layers. Perhaps the black mantle marked a rebirth not of power, but of purpose. Shedding the sanctioned identity of the Church, these knights may have embraced a new creed, one forged in exile and fire. A creed free from the politics of Rome and the grasp of monarchs. A creed that spoke in silence and hid in plain sight. Some contemporary chroniclers dismiss this as nothing more than the fantasies of disbanded soldiers and frightened peasants. Yet intriguingly, certain knightly brotherhoods that sprang up in the decades following the suppression bear unmistakable similarities to the old Templar model, but with notable shifts. Hierarchies still exist. Oaths are taken. Symbols recur. But their vestments dark, and often lined or fringed with crimson. This transition wasn't uniform. In Castile, members of the Order of Montesa maintained the traditional white. But in certain Iberian enclaves, there were reports of rogue night cells conducting ceremonies by moonlight, dressed in black surcoats and wielding blades etched with unfamiliar script. A notary in Aragon described stumbling upon one such gathering. He was found 3 days later, shaken mute, clutching a scroll bound in red wax bearing a sigil with concentric circles, and at its center a reversed cross not of blasphemy, but of secrecy. It's not that these garments were hidden. On the contrary, they seemed designed to signal something to the initiated, a coded message in cloth. To the average traveler, they might appear as mercenaries or monks, but to those who had once worn the white, who had seen the betrayal and remembered the fire, the black mantle was a beacon, a symbol that the order had not died, only changed. And then there's the curious case of the cloaked riders in the Jura Mountains. In 1323, local abbots sent reports to the bishop in Besançon about a procession of black-robed warriors appearing during Easter week. They made no demands, asked no favor, simply walked the mountain pass in silence, then vanished into the forest. None were identified. No footprints remained. But the site left a lasting impression and was commemorated in a woodcut decades later. A single knight, faceless beneath his hood, stands on a cliff's edge staring west. The caption reads simply, Custodes Umbrarum, Keepers of the Shadows. A question lingers naturally. Why black? Was it merely a disguise, a rejection of the past? Or something deeper, a reflection of a philosophy forged not in glory, but in betrayal? Perhaps the black cloak was not just to hide the wearer, but to mark him. After all, black absorbs light. It does not reflect. And in a world that turned against them, maybe the Templars stopped trying to reflect divine glory and instead chose to absorb darkness, to take it in, contain it, and turn it into resolve. Curiously, some of the figures seen wearing the black cloak carried small pendants, circular metallic, etched with 7 spokes. These pendants don't match any known Christian relic, but similar patterns appear in Gnostic iconography, specifically among sects known for hiding teachings deemed heretical by the Church. Whether this connection is real or symbolic is hard to say, but the image returns again and again in the margins of texts on stones, even in the center of an iron shield uncovered near Toulouse. 7 spokes, 1 circle, and always black. Whatever they were wearing and whatever they were doing, it wasn't random. It was ritual, coordinated, deliberate, and the cloak, it was just the beginning. A signal, a declaration, a vow worn on the body not to be seen, but to be recognized. When fire began licking at the edges of the Templar world, many looked north or east for answers to Scotland's rebellious highlands, or to the Germanic orders nestled in Teutonic fortresses. But the smarter ones, the ones who had always understood that survival demanded more than courage, looked south, toward Iberia, toward kingdoms where kings still whispered in Latin, but their loyalties ran more along the lines of opportunity than obedience. Castile, Aragon, Leon, even Navarre caught between feuds and frontiers. These weren't just places on a map. They were pressure points in a Europe still fractured, still medieval, still desperately trying to find the edges of its own shadow. And while the Church wagged its finger and France sharpened its axes, the Iberian monarchies saw a different opportunity in the fall of the Templars' leverage. The records are frustratingly sparse, or perhaps deliberately so. A handful of royal decrees survive from the early 1310s, marked with unusual phrasing. In a charter dated 1313, King Ferdinand IV of Castile refers cryptically to the silent guardians of Santiago, granting them right of passage through the coastal enclaves in exchange for silence and service. No names, no sigils, just permissions disguised as favors, a blank check in Latin. Historians have struggled to reconcile these gaps. Officially, the Templars were suppressed across Iberia like the rest of Europe. Unofficially, the picture is murkier. While France enthusiastically arrested and tortured its Templar population, Castile and Aragon hesitated. Some knights were detained, briefly questioned, then quietly released. Others were simply asked to reconsider their oaths. A few vanished altogether. One curious entry from a 1315 monastery ledger in Burgos lists a brother Juan of Jerusalem as arriving with 6 foreign companions seeking shelter. They stayed for 3 weeks, gave generous donations, then disappeared. The record is signed with a seal, not the typical Templar cross, but a twin sword motif in dark wax. No one knows where they went next, but the monastery itself was later reinforced with funds from an unknown patron. There's also the matter of the Black Passage. That's what it was called in folk stories from the coast El Paso Negro. A rumored corridor stretching from the Bay of Biscay, through secret forest paths and into the interior. Sailors in Santander would whisper of dark-cloaked men emerging from the mist, speaking a strange blend of Latin and Occitan, offering gold for silence and safe travel. One old sea shanty, barely preserved in a 16th-century anthology, refers to Los Caballeros del Humo, the Knights of Smoke who ride the tides when the king turns his face. It's not just stories. A 19th-century restoration of an old tower in Oviedo uncovered a hidden basement chamber. Inside, carved into stone, was the faint outline of a compass, rose identical to the one found in the Genoese logbook centuries earlier. 7 spokes, a serpent at the edge, and near it a Latin inscription, nulla retrorsum, never backward. Perhaps the most tangible trace lies in the preserved records of the Order of Calatrava. Unlike the Templars, Calatrava was a native Spanish military order that survived papal suppression. But beginning around 1315, their ranks swelled abruptly and without clear explanation. Membership lists from this period are riddled with entries marked Transitus ex Oriente Passage from the East, and many of those entries are curiously devoid of surnames. Could these have been former Templars men who walked away from the White Cross and into a new allegiance? Or perhaps no allegiance at all, merely a pact of mutual silence? A particularly tantalizing document comes from the archives of Zaragoza, where a royal advisor penned a report in 1317 warning of foreign knights assembling near the border, well-trained and funded, loyal to no crown, bearing symbols I do not recognize. His tone isn't accusatory, it's wary, respectful even, as if he's describing not invaders but something older, something enduring. The same document notes an unusual detail: these knights bore cloaks lined with red on the inside, not the outside. A reversal of traditional Templar regalia. To any casual observer, they'd seem nondescript, but to those who knew the old codes, the inversion would scream defiance. And then there are the fonts. Across rural Castile, in stone chapels often attributed to nameless builders, certain baptismal fonts bear carvings that don't quite match Christian orthodoxy. Circular patterns, crosses inside spirals. One in particular at a small church in Segovia is inscribed with the words Renati in Flamma, reborn in flame. It's a peculiar phrase for a Christian ritual, but strikingly appropriate for knights who watched their world burn and chose to walk forward anyway. These aren't accidents. They're fingerprints, traces left not in gold or glory, but in architecture, in silence, and in cloth. And when viewed together, they sketch a picture not of a fallen order, but of a rerouted one. A shadow lineage winding through Iberia like a river underground, unseen, but always moving. Call it survival, call it reinvention, call it treason if you like. But they were there, and they were watching. If there was one place in medieval Europe where fugitives could vanish like smoke into stone, it was Scotland. Wild, fractured, and bristling with resistance, the highlands and borderlands were no strangers to secret pacts and whispered oaths. And by the early 14th century, when the flames of France consumed the Templar order, the winds blowing north smelled less like smoke and more like opportunity. Officially, Scotland had little to offer a crumbling brotherhood. It was excommunicated, caught in a bitter war for independence, and only loosely tethered to papal authority. But from another perspective, say that of a hunted knight with no allegiance left but survival, it was perfect. The king was an outlaw hero. The church held no real teeth. And perhaps most importantly, there were allies already waiting. The name that echoes most through this corridor of speculation is Robert the Bruce. In 1307, the same year, Jacques de Molay was arrested in France. Bruce had just been excommunicated for the murder of a rival in a church, Not exactly a papal darling, but to many he was the last hope of a free Scotland. Is it coincidence that the years of Bruce's ascent overlap so precisely with the Templars' downfall? No direct record links Bruce to the Templars, but absence in this case speaks volumes. The Scottish Church remained remarkably quiet about the Templar crisis. Unlike England, which dutifully arrested its knights, or Spain, which carefully documented its mercy, Scottish records are conspicuously blank. A few references to foreign brothers seeking audience, and one cryptic entry in the Chronicle of St. Andrews mentioning the order that arrives but never leaves. But then there is Bannockburn, the legendary battle of 1314 where Bruce's forces humiliated the might of England, has long been studied for its unorthodox tactics, sudden flank attacks, near-perfect timing, and a mysterious appearance of armored horsemen late in the conflict. Contemporary English sources describe this group as new riders, unidentified reinforcements, and in one account, knights bearing crosses but none ours. They emerged from the nearby woods, struck a decisive blow, and then disappeared. Modern historians attribute this to exaggeration, fog of war, literary flourish. But it's difficult to ignore the resonance. Cloaked riders marked by a cross, but belonging to no known banner, appearing just long enough to tip the scales. You might recall from the Southern Trail the mention of the Black Mantle. In Scotland, there are no surviving garments, but in a museum archive in Stirling lies a piece of dark fabric wool, dense, expertly stitched, found near the battlefield. It bears no heraldic markings. But interwoven into the hem is a thread pattern unmistakably similar to known Templar needlework. Some say it's coincidence, others call it forgery, but the fabric itself refuses to offer answers. Another clue lies beneath Rosslyn Chapel, or rather beneath the legends that surround it. Though built more than a century later, the Sinclair family that commissioned Rosslyn has long been associated with Templar lore. William Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, traced his lineage to crusading knights, and the chapel's carvings are famously strange maze long before Columbus angels with Masonic geometry, and among them a solitary knight in full armor draped in what appears to be a black surcoat with a faded cross pressed into the stone behind him. But Scotland's hidden sanctuary wasn't just about stone and blood. It was also about transition. Here the Templars, or whatever they became, had a rare luxury time. Removed from continental scrutiny, they could regroup, retrain, reformulate. The vast stretches of uninhabited highlands were ideal for concealment, but also communion. There are oral traditions among the MacDonald and Campbell clans of the Silent Riders, who brought gold and books but asked for no titles. Some say these strangers taught their ancestors the geometry of fortresses. Others claim they came only to pray beneath the northern sky. In 1320, the Declaration of Arbroath was sent to Pope John XIII, a letter from the Scottish nobles asserting their independence. Curiously, its language leans heavily into divine justice, brotherhood, and redemption after betrayal themes that echo nearly word-for-word statements made by Templars under trial just a decade prior. A borrowed rhetoric or a collaboration? There's more. A chapel ruin near Inverness, long believed to be abandoned in the 15th century, was found during a recent excavation to contain a hidden crypt. Inside were fragmented manuscripts mostly unreadable, and a single wall carving of a ship at sea, its sail marked not with a white cross, but a black one. It seems absurd at first that a group hunted across Europe could find safety in the chaos of Scotland. But consider what they truly needed: not peace, not wealth, but space. Time to reforge their oath. Time to rewrite their creed. And perhaps time to forget what they once were. The Black Templars, if we may now begin to call them, that were not seeking to reclaim their past. They were engineering a future, one where they would not be beholden to kings or popes, but to an older silence, a deeper vow. And the further north you go, the quieter it gets, until even the stone seems to whisper. If you were to scan the surface of European history in the early 14th century, Portugal might not catch your eye. A young kingdom on the western fringe, its internal squabbles often overshadowed by the broader chaos of papal decrees and dynastic feuds. But look a little deeper, and you'll find something remarkable, a flicker of continuity in the darkness left by the Templars' collapse. Not resistance, not rebellion, but reincarnation. It begins as these things often do, with a loophole. King Dinis of Portugal, ever the pragmatic monarch, found himself in a delicate situation after the Templars were officially dissolved by papal bull in 1312. He had benefited from the order's vast wealth and infrastructure, fortresses, farmland, shipyards. Losing them would weaken his kingdom, but defying the Pope outright could bring ruin. So he did what clever kings do, he rebranded. In 1319, with quiet support from the papacy, Dinis established the Order of Christ, a new military brotherhood meant to inherit the Templars' assets and missions. At least that was the official line. In reality, the men who formed its core were not new at all. Many were former Templars. They simply removed one cross from their tunics and stitched on another. Their vows remained. Their hierarchy remained. Even their rituals, cloaked now in altered language and layered meaning, continued beneath a different name. The Church could tolerate this fiction. Portugal, after all, wasn't France. There were fewer inquisitors, fewer eyes, fewer fires, and the Order of Christ provided a politically acceptable solution, a safe container for dangerous men. But over time, this container began to shift in shape. What had started as a compromise grew teeth and purpose. One of the earliest Grand Masters of the Order of Christ, Gil Martins, had served directly under the Templars. His seal bore the typical 8-pointed cross, but in his later years, that cross began appearing within a circle of stars, a motif not previously associated with the order. On one surviving manuscript tucked into the margin is a strange little addition, a miniature ship sailing west beneath the words, "Non excidit lux, the light does not die." That light, it seems, had merely gone to ground. In the archives of Tamar, the former Templar stronghold and soon the headquarters of the Order of Christ, records indicate a curious rise in architectural modifications during the 1320s. Secret staircases, false chapels, chambers with no official purpose. One in particular, discovered during 20th century restorations, contains a carved map of the Mediterranean with 4 unmarked islands and a compass rose bearing 7 points. Again, the same sigil. Again, the same mystery. From a distance, it all looked legitimate. The Order of Christ fought in the Reconquista, built churches, even helped fund early explorations along the Atlantic coast. But within its ranks, something older stirred, an ethos, a creed passed hand to hand, preserved not in books, but in ritual. A rule reborn, not rewritten. A curious document survives in the personal correspondence of Prince Henry the Navigator, one of the order's most famous members. In it, he thanks an unnamed master of the interior brotherhood for the ciphered charts and the compass of dusk. The letter is dated 1434, decades after the Templars' supposed extinction, yet its tone is reverent, subordinate, and beneath Henry's signature is drawn faintly a version of the Templar cross, but black, not red. We are left then with a question. Did Portugal offer sanctuary, or did it offer something far more potent, a vessel? Because if the Black Templars did survive, they could not do so as fugitives forever. They needed structure, territory, legitimacy, and Portugal, unwitting or not, gave them all three. Not as knights of the temple, but as knights of Christ, cloaked in new names, but animated by the same fire. Some skeptics argue this is too neat, that the Order of Christ was simply a patriotic military order repurposed for the Reconquista and later colonial expansion. But then why the secrecy? Why the symbols? Why the insistence across centuries that something sacred was being protected, not just in scripture but in shadow, even today? Deep in the convent of Christ in Tamar, there's a circular chapel known as the Corolla. Its walls are lined with images of knights and angels, their faces worn by time. But near the high altar, behind a layer of faded paint, restoration teams uncovered something startling in 1997. A hidden carving of a man in a black mantle, his head bowed, and in his hand a scroll bearing a snake coiled around a cross. It was never meant to be seen. But someone placed it there anyway, a message across time perhaps. A reminder. The Templar rule was never broken, only renamed, rehoused. And beneath Portugal's sun, it quietly learned how to endure. The Alps were never built for comfort. They are sharp things, ragged and ancient, where the roads curve like riddles and even the echoes seem hesitant to return. To hide in the Alps is to surrender yourself to the mountain, and the Black Templars, if the reports are to be believed, did just that. The 14th century saw the rise of monastic accounts from alpine abbeys describing inexplicable encounters, armored horsemen dressed in dark cloaks, moving in disciplined formation, bearing a red cross dulled to near shadow. They did not ask for shelter. They did not speak. They rode. At first, these sightings were interpreted as local militias or remnants of crusading bands passing through. But discrepancies quickly surfaced. The riders bore no known crests. They rode in silence. And most tellingly, they disappeared into snowfields where there were no paths. More than one monk wrote that the tracks these riders left behind simply ended. Not faded, ended. An illuminated manuscript from the Abbey of St. Bernard, dated 1336, depicts a strange scene. On one page, a hooded figure on horseback descending from mist. On the next, the same figure standing in a chapel helmet removed his face, pale and unreadable. In the corner of the page, scribbled almost as an afterthought, Milites Obscurae, the Dark Knights. The phrase would not appear again for another 60 years, and yet here it was pressed into vellum like a fingerprint. Historically, the region had significance to the Templars. Several minor commanderies once dotted the Alpine passes, especially in Savoy and the Rhone Valley. After the suppression, these holdings were quietly transferred to the Hospitallers, but no records indicate a handover. They were simply taken by someone. In one such former commandery near Chamonix, a collapsed tunnel was unearthed in the late 1800s. Within it lay rusted weaponry candle stubs and a ceremonial cup inscribed with Lux Absentia, light from absence. A few scraps of a torn banner were recovered, black cloth stiff with age embroidered with a red emblem, now too faded to decipher. But one of the fragments bore a Latin letter M. Scholars assumed it meant militum for of the knights. Others, however, remembered another phrase, nigrum militum, the same phrase found in the Florentine margins, the same one whispered in Iberia, the Black Order again. One might think these are all isolated fragments, folklore stitched into history, with just enough thread to pass as legend. But the consistency is too tight. Monks across separate abbeys in different decades described the same phenomenon: knights appearing during holy days, passing silently through valleys, praying briefly in chapels, before riding into the mist again. Not thieves, not pilgrims. something else. A monk at the Abbey of Dissentis left behind a particularly detailed account. He described awakening during matins to the sound of hooves on stone. When he went outside, he saw 5 riders dismounting in the courtyard, heads bowed. They entered the chapel, knelt for 10 minutes, then left without a word. The monk noted a smell like metal and incense, and a phrase one of them murmured, which he heard only once: "Guardians do not knock." Years later, in a nearby village, a family claimed to have been paid in gold florins by travelers in black for delivering supplies to a hidden camp in the mountains. When questioned, the father claimed the men spoke Latin fluently and bore silver rings with no family crest, only a circular mark resembling a compass rose. The Alps offered more than sanctuary. They offered invisibility. From the dense woods of Valais to the forgotten caverns of Tyrol, the mountains swallowed roads, erased footsteps, and disguised fortresses as cliffs. If the Black Templars wished to move undetected across Europe, there was no better artery than the Alps. And if they wished to meet to hold conclaves or conduct rituals, no better cathedral than a snow-covered plateau beneath the stars. In fact, a 15th-century letter from a disgraced Swiss cleric hints at just such a gathering. He writes of a midwinter assembly near Lake Geneva, where men of the clothless vow arrived in pairs, never speaking aloud, each carrying a sealed document marked with the wax of black serpents. He calls them custodes tenebrae, keepers of the darkness. The meeting lasted a single night, and when he returned days later, all trace had vanished, except for a circle of black stones set perfectly into the snow. Some might scoff. Knights on horseback in snow and silence. But this was not the age of mass surveillance or border controls. A disciplined group could move like ghosts across mountain passes so long as they paid, prayed, and vanished quickly. And the Black Templars, if they still lived, had mastered that art. It's easy to imagine that these riders were nothing more than overactive imaginations. But the pattern suggests intention. Pilgrimages without shrines, guards without kingdoms, messages without paper. And perhaps the most chilling thought is this: what if they weren't passing through? What if they were staying? What if the Alps weren't just a highway for their silence, but the cradle of their rebirth? Tucked into the damp mist of eastern France, the Vosges Mountains don't immediately strike you as a place of revelation. They are gentle by alpine standards, older, softer, more wooded. But it's often in such quiet places that shadows grow deepest. And it is here, in a web of forgotten abbeys and silent ruins, that the next thread of the Black Templars begins to glimmer. The Templars had holdings in the region before their suppression. Modest commanderies, humble chapels, even a few fortified farms. But after the arrests of 1307, these sites should have been emptied, their contents inventoried, their walls stripped of banners. Yet centuries later, explorers and clerics alike continued to find traces not of abandonment, but of occupation. One of the first real clues came in 1622 during renovations of a crumbling priory outside Epinal. While dismantling a wall, workers uncovered a narrow passage leading to a sealed stone chamber. Inside were 3 skeletons still in armor, rusted chainmail, dull swords. One wore a ring silver inset with onyx engraved with a cross within a circle. Nearby lay a scroll case long since decayed, but the wax seal had survived, black, cracked, and bearing the imprint of a double-headed eagle coiled in serpents. The bishop overseeing the site ordered silence. The remains were reburied in consecrated ground, and the chamber resealed. But a monk wrote of the discovery in his personal diary, calling the men keepers of vows no longer spoken. This was not an isolated case. In the Abbey of Senones, An 18th century inventory notes inaccessible cells discovered beneath the floorboards of the library. One cell contained a wooden bench, a single candle holder, and a carved stone basin stained with something dark. On the wall, a faded inscription in Latin videre est tacere to see is to remain silent. Local legend speaks of les moines d'ombre, the monks of shadow who passed through these abbeys dressed not in white or brown, but in black. They neither sang nor begged. They fasted in silence, vanished before dawn, and were never recorded in the monastery rolls. Some say they arrived with winter storms. Others believe they lived there hidden in the stone beneath the ordinary clergy, like a second secret congregation. One abbey destroyed during the 30 Years' War was said to contain a sub-chapel accessible only through a rotating slab behind the altar. Locals called it La Chambre du Serpentin. It was never officially confirmed. But during a 1930s excavation of the site, archaeologists uncovered a foundation stone etched with a 7-spoked wheel, the same image that had appeared in Iberian fonts, Scottish crypts, and Portuguese chapels. The repetition of this symbol across borders, languages, and centuries is more than coincidence. It suggests a continuity of message, a visual liturgy passed like a torch through generations. And the fact that it appears most often in locations tied to these black-garbed apparitions only strengthens the pattern. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery came not in stone, but in song. Among the musical manuscripts found in the Abbey of Luxeuil is a fragment of an uncredited chant, written in modal notation, bearing the title Ordo sub rosa, the order beneath the rose. The lyrics are cryptic, invoking imagery of flame and shadow of stars, and silence of those who drink not from the chalice but from the cup of iron. The melody itself is discordant, liturgical in structure, yet strangely hypnotic. Modern scholars who have attempted to transcribe it report feelings of unease as though the music weren't meant for performance, but for remembrance. One might argue all of this is romantic superstition, the invention of frightened monks, over-imaginative scribes, or 20th century occultists. But then there's the pattern of altered insignias. In several abbey seals from the 14th century, the familiar Templar cross is present but changed. It's tilted, distorted, or wrapped with vines. One shows the cross inverted within a black circle. Another, preserved on a parchment in the Strasbourg archives, frames it with 7 small stars. None of these variations appear in official ecclesiastical iconography, yet they're all found in abbeys that reported at one time or another visits by brothers without name, and the clergy some helped, some turned away, and some vanished themselves. A Dominican friar from Nancy wrote of a brotherhood beneath the brotherhood, claiming he had witnessed secret masses held at midnight, lit only by candlelight, and recited in a language unfamiliar to him, not Latin, not French. A mixture, perhaps, a cipher. When he tried to confront the abbot, he was dismissed, then sent to Rome. He never returned. It is possible that the Vosges became a kind of layover, a midway sanctuary for Black Templars moving between Iberia, the Alps, and Eastern Europe. A chain of resting places connected not by orders or titles, but by silence. They left no obvious trail because they weren't trying to reclaim power. They were trying to preserve something, a code, a ritual, a truth. And the abbeys, quiet and aging, never asked questions. Stone doesn't judge. It only remembers. The Vatican has never been short on secrets. Beneath the golden domes and painted ceilings, behind velvet ropes and polished altars, there lies a vault, literal and metaphorical, of things the Church has deemed too dangerous, too powerful, or simply too inconvenient to let into the light. And among those thousands of scrolls and bound ledgers, one peculiar registry exists, Hidden, yes, but not forgotten. They call it Catalogus Ordinum Non Conformium, the catalogue of non-compliant orders. It is not public. It was never meant to be. Yet fragments of it have surfaced over the centuries, not as full documents, but as references in letters, marginal notes, or private memoranda passed between cardinals and inquisitors. One such letter dated 1451 and sent from a Vatican archivist to a bishop in Avignon contains a single explosive line, "Be vigilant." There are whispers of the nigrum militum within the German border. Cross-refer with registry item 14Q obscura. The phrase nigrum militum, the Black Knights, had been encountered before, buried in the margins of Florentine manuscripts and carved into Iberian fonts. But here it sat in the very correspondence of the Vatican itself, cross-referenced, catalogued. It was not a peasant myth or monastic legend. It was a recognized entity, at least behind locked doors. Piecing together what little remains of this registry paints a picture not of mythological fantasy, but of bureaucratic fear. The Church, it seems, maintained a list of knightly or clerical orders that were considered dangerous, not necessarily heretical, but deviant, unbound by papal structure, operating in secrecy, sometimes charitable, sometimes martial, often invisible. Of the known references to registry entries, one stands out above the rest. Entry 14Q obscura, the same one mentioned in the letter. A second document preserved in the archive of a defunct Jesuit college in Milan includes a partial transcription of that entry. It reads, "Order presumed extinct, post 1312. Sightings recorded in Burgundy, Savoy, and Tyrol. Attributes black habit, modified Templar insignia, no declared allegiance to church or crown. Threat level variable. Observed behaviors suggest organized hierarchy and ritual." That one phrase, modified Templar insignia, is the dagger in the veil. It doesn't say related to or possibly resembling. It says modified, as in adapted, as in intentionally changed by people who once wore the original. There is more. A footnote hastily scrawled and barely legible reads, "Insignia in this case includes black cross with an eclipse motif resemblance to glyph recovered from Gisor's cache. Further investigation discouraged unless sanctioned." The eclipse motif had surfaced before on pendants in Castile, on chapel carvings in the Vosges, even in the shadowy designs found under the Convent of Christ in Portugal. The symbol that seemed to follow no nation, no creed, and yet kept reappearing in places Templars should have long vanished from. Why then would the Vatican record these sightings but not act? That question lingers like incense in a sealed room. Perhaps it was prudence. Perhaps fear. After the chaos of the Templar suppression, the confessions, the trials, the executions, the Church may have realized it had stirred something it could no longer control. Not all enemies raise banners and storm castles. Some move beneath. Some survive through silence. An unnamed inquisitor writing in 1478 references an aborted investigation into a nocturnal assembly of cloaked men in Verona. His notes are brief but vivid. They met beneath the chapel. Not one spoke, only gestures. All wore rings, a bowl of oil unlit. When they saw me, no panic, only stillness. I left in haste. I did not return. He signs the document not with his name, but with the sign of the cross. And beneath it, a single Latin phrase, non est ordo. Est vigil. This is not an order, it is a watch. The deeper you go into Vatican channels, the more common this motif becomes: silence, black vestments, red embroidery, and encoded behavior. In some cases, inquisitors seem to have turned a blind eye, preferring to classify sightings as isolated or of unknown order. One wonders whether they were instructed to do so. After all, if the Black Templars had truly fractured from Rome but remained powerful, secretive, and unpredictable, was it not better to let them move unseen so long as they did not challenge the Church directly, control by ignorance? Surveillance without confrontation. It's a method older than the papacy itself. One particularly strange report surfaces in 1562 during the Council of Trent. A note passed between two bishops, preserved only in transcription, mentions the return of the Watchers. It is quickly dismissed in the record filed as metaphor. But what precisely were they watching? It's important to remember the Vatican is not a monolith. It is a city of whispers built by centuries of contradictions. And while one wing may suppress, another may observe. Perhaps some factions within the Church believed the Black Templars had taken on a sacred burden. Perhaps they were tolerated not because of fear, but because of necessity. No official admission has ever come, but unofficially their presence is carved into the paperwork, like ghosts caught in carbon copy. And so the registry endures. Quietly in the corners of Vatican vaults, not alphabetized, not indexed, just waiting. Because the Church never forgets. It only files things under restricted access. Far from Rome and the fires of Paris in the cold marshlands of the Baltic frontier, the sword of Christ was carried by other hands. Here among the forests and frozen rivers of Livonia, modern-day Latvia and Estonia, the Teutonic Knights held dominion. They were austere, efficient, and loyal to their own brand of order. And yet buried in their correspondence, one finds odd anomalies. Letters, codes, warnings, mentions of outsiders not accounted for in any battle plan or treaty. They called them fratres flammae, the brothers of flame. To understand the context, it helps to know the Teutonic order. Unlike the Templars, who were multinational and cosmopolitan, the Teutonic Knights were rigidly Germanic, deeply insular, and entirely devoted to expansion through conversion, often by the sword. Yet even they kept records, and even they knew when something didn't add up. In a letter dated 1342, addressed to the Master of the Order in Marienburg, a commander stationed near Dorpat writes, "We encountered them again, the riders in black. Not of us, not of Rome. They bore no standards, yet we knew their purpose. They did not interfere, they only watched." It's a chilling detail, and a consistent one. Over the course of 2 decades, at least 7 letters from different Teutonic strongholds reference these mysterious figures. They are described as well-armed, silent, and seemingly familiar with Teutonic rituals, even anticipating movements of supply lines and patrol routes. Yet no one claimed them. They reported to no bishop, no grand master, no crown. And still they appeared always in black, always observing. One letter goes further. Written in cipher, cracked only in the 19th century, it describes a meeting between a Teutonic knight and what he calls a man of the buried flame. The man bore a seal, a red cross, in a black circle, identical to those recovered from Templar ruins in the Vosges and near La Rochelle. The knight writes, "He spoke little, but his eyes knew too much. He asked no favors. Only that we not light fires on the old ground again." Old ground. What did he mean? Some believe this refers to sacred territory, perhaps pre-Christian or Gnostic sites the Templars once protected. Others suggest it's metaphorical, a warning not to stir up old conflicts. But either way, it shows that the Black Templars, or whatever they were becoming, had knowledge of the Eastern Front far beyond what exiles from France should have possessed. There's also the matter of the flame. It appears in multiple contexts not as fire or destruction, but as a symbol of preservation. One letter calls the riders custodes ignis, the guardians of fire. Another, written in Latin but laced with Low German, uses a curious phrase, flamma sine fumo, flame without smoke. The implication is mystical. A fire that burns but does not consume. A light that reveals but does not blind. These phrases echo an earlier term we've already heard, ex tenebris lux, from darkness light. But now here in Livonia that light is described not as divine, but as contained. Carried. Like a torch passed from one age to the next, never fully extinguished, never publicly seen. It is in this context that we encounter the most bizarre artifact of all, the Livonian map. Preserved in the National Library of Estonia, the map is believed to date to the late 14th century. It's rough sketched in charcoal and faded ink, likely intended for internal use. But it bears two inexplicable features. First, it contains a trail, a path through the dense forests marked not by towns or forts, but by 7 equidistant sigils, circles enclosing serpents, each facing a different direction. No explanation accompanies them. The second feature is a small illustration in the map's lower margin, a rider in black holding a lantern beneath which is written, Illa qui custodit, he who guards. This isn't Teutonic language, it's older. It resembles the codices found in Templar manuscripts, the kind smuggled out of Cyprus and scattered across Europe in the years after 1307. Why would this symbolism appear here on a map used by Northern Crusaders fighting pagans? Because perhaps the Black Templars were not merely hiding, they were watching the watchers. Infiltrating borderlands not to convert, but to observe. Not to conquer, but to continue. Like an intelligence network operating beneath the crusade itself. There are even whispers of conflict. A destroyed village near the Daugava River bore no signs of typical pagan revolt, no fires, no looting. But within the wreckage, a stone slab was found carved with a symbol later identified as the inverted Templar cross, surrounded by ash, but intact. A message, perhaps, or a warning, or both. It's easy to overlook Livonia in the Grand Templar narrative. It's far from Jerusalem, distant from Rome, irrelevant to the politics of the French crown. But that's exactly what makes it perfect. A place where secrecy could thrive, where vigilance could sharpen. A cold borderland where a dying order could reforge itself unnoticed. And so they came not to fight, not to preach, but to endure. As the Teutonic letters fade into silence by the end of the 14th century, so too do the sightings. But the phrase "brothers of flame" persists. It appears once more centuries later in a Masonic pamphlet printed in Königsberg. They came in silence, bore no name, and lit the flame that does not burn. Some candles were never meant to go out. Venice in the 15th century was a city of veils, veils of silk, of trade, of politics, of secrets. A place where merchant princes rubbed shoulders with spies and monasteries doubled as banks. If the Black Templars had survived the fires of France and the exile of Portugal, then Venice, with its labyrinthine alleys and masked rituals, would have suited them perfectly. In a journal preserved within the archives of the San Giorgio Monastery, there lies a peculiar entry dated March 7, 1439. The author, Father Giulio Verani, was a Dominican with a keen eye for the unusual. His note begins, like many others, commentary on trade fluctuations, a complaint about the humidity. But then comes this: a visitor came tonight. Dressed in the fashion of the Holy Land, yet not Eastern. Neither young nor old. Eyes like parchment soaked in ink. He claimed no title, no family. But all knelt when he entered. The man gave no name. Giulio calls him only Il Cavaliere delle Due Età, the Knight of Two Ages. He stayed 3 nights at the monastery, spoke little, refused confession. He spent most of his time in the library, never taking notes, but thumbing through texts that even the brothers rarely touched. books of ancient geometry, obscure Gnostic hymns, and a sealed copy of the Liber de Figura, a forbidden manuscript detailing symbolic architecture, believed to be used by orders not sanctioned by the throne of Peter. Giulio's tone becomes increasingly unsettled. On the second night, he writes, "He prayed without moving his lips. The candles did not flicker in his cell. A ring on his hand bore the double cross, not one above the other, but one behind. A sign I have only seen once, in the ruins of Acre." The ruins of Acre had fallen over a century earlier, yet the symbol had lingered in graffiti and forgotten heraldry, in the margins of discarded maps, and now, apparently, on the hand of a man who walked like he remembered it. On the morning of his departure, Giulio followed the knight to the eastern cloister. There, under cover of mist, 3 men waited, each cloaked in black, their faces obscured. The knight turned, only once said nothing, and vanished into the fog. No name, no destination. Only a faint print left in the wet stone, shaped not by boot, but by something older, a star 7-pointed, pressed lightly into the moss. You've heard echoes of this star before. In Portugal, in Castile, on forgotten altars in the Vosges. But here in the heart of Venice it becomes something more, not just a symbol of passage, but of leadership. Giulio would later speculate in a private letter smuggled to a colleague in Avignon that he had met not a knight, but a master. One who walks through centuries as through smoke. The phrase Grand Master is never used, but the structure of the Templar order required one. And if the Black Templars endured it, follows that they too would have chosen or protected such a figure. Not to command in the old way beneath papal banners and kingly whims, but to maintain the flame, to pass the rite, to guard the memory. A Masonic document from the early 1600s, discovered in the ruins of a Venetian printing house, contains a coded diagram labeled Lumen X Persona. The figure at its center is robed faceless and surrounded by 12 smaller symbols, each representing a different region of Europe. The figure holds no scepter, no sword, only a key. In the lower margin, a phrase, "He who names himself is not the true one." This aversion to titles becomes a defining feature. Later accounts of similar figures, always male, always cloaked, always described as neither aged nor youthful, refer to them as custodes, the watchers, or simply the one who listens. And they do not lead through command, but presence. Like a torch in a storm, not shouting, not directing, simply glowing. Even in Venice, such figures became legend. Gondoliers told stories of a man who walked the bridges of the city on nights of lunar eclipse, always alone, always silent. Children sang rhymes about the knight who knows your dreams. Most dismissed it as folklore. But in the year 1492, the same year a Genoese sailor prepared to cross the Atlantic, a private ledger of the Scuola di San Marco includes a strange expense, silk black, tailored for foreign guest. Payment waived, benediction received. He left no name. But the ledger included a drawing of the ring he wore, the cross within the eclipse, always the same. The question, of course, is not whether such a man existed, but whether he still does. A Grand Master who does not rule but remembers. A custodian not of gold or relics, but of silence. A silence that stretches from Paris to Lisbon, from Tamar to the Alps, from Acre to Venice. A silence held not by accident, but by design. Because the Black Templars, if they survived, would have needed more than hideouts and rituals. They would have needed direction. Not to fight, not to lead armies, but to endure. To weave their purpose across centuries without being seen. And so somewhere in the fog, a man with no name may still be walking. He doesn't carry a sword. He carries memory. Seals were the language of power. In medieval Europe, a seal was not just a flourish. It was authority, a signature that held the weight of law, faith, or empire. So when inquisitors in the 15th century began discovering documents bearing a wax insignia, they couldn't trace dark, crude, and pressed with a symbol outside the heraldic canon. Alarms rang, quietly of course, because this sigil wasn't defiant, it was deliberate. It first appeared in Rouen in a sealed chest retrieved from a merchant suspected of trafficking forbidden relics. Inside were contracts, coded letters, and one small leather-bound book unsigned but heavy with references to Brothers of Silence. The seal affixed to the cover was black, not red, not gold, and bore the faint imprint of a Templar cross within a coiled serpent. The ink used in the ledger was rust-colored, almost brown. Later analysis would reveal it to be mixed with iron and blood. At the time, inquisitors assumed it was a hoax, or worse, a piece of occult propaganda meant to provoke. But more turned up. In Avignon, a noble family was investigated for hosting unlicensed chapel gatherings in the dead of night. The household staff claimed to have seen men in dark mantles arrive with no introduction, their hands gloved, their eyes covered. They stayed for hours, then left, leaving behind a scroll sealed in wax. The family matriarch claimed it was a prayer, but the seal identical. Black, circular, the coiled cross. Even within the Vatican's private archives, specifically among the fragments attributed to the catalogue's Ordinum Nonconformium, there is a notation in the margin seal recovered near Lyon 14:4-1, pressed with same symbol found in 14Q Obscura. Black wax, possible linkage to extinguished order. Further analysis prohibited. The implications were unsettling. If this sigil was real and consistent, it meant that some group active long after the Templars' official suppression was continuing to operate under a private code of communication. Not only that, they were disciplined enough to spread their network across France, Italy, and the Rhine Valley without leaving a trail of names. Only wax, only symbols. The deeper one digs, the more curious it becomes. A merchant ledger from Bruges lists several transactions under the initials MRS. These appear repeatedly between 1433 and 1447, always paid in advance, always requesting transport for pilgrims under vow. One receipt notes a shipment of iron instruments for sacred use and includes a sketch of the seal not as a decoration, but as an identifier. The merchant adds, they insist it be burned after receipt. Not broken, burned. Seals that are burned rather than broken suggest ritual, a purification perhaps, or the obliteration of evidence. Either way, this is not behavior learned from merchants. It is learned from monastic discipline, from orders that took their ceremonies seriously. And that brings us to a small village chapel in northern Burgundy, abandoned, now swallowed by vines. During conservation work in the late 1990s, a stone box was discovered beneath the altar. Inside, a parchment too damaged to read, and a wax seal preserved in the cold. Black as always, but this one bore something new. In the center of the usual coiled cross stood a tiny flame, etched delicately into the wax. Not burning upward, but enclosed within the coil as if protected, as if watched. That flame appears elsewhere if you know where to look. In the frescoes of a ruined Templar chapel near Toulouse, the tail of a serpent curls into the base of a cross, and at its heart, a candle. In a Gnostic fragment uncovered in Geneva, the phrase lux in obscura circumdata light, surrounded by darkness, appears beneath a stylized star with 7 rays. The flame, it seems, is a metaphor for memory, not triumph, not vengeance, but endurance. And if the Black Templars were anything, they were patient. Even the nature of the seal itself blood mixed with wax suggests symbolism. Not merely secrecy, but sacrifice, an echo of oath-taking ceremonies, perhaps a token of the new vow that replaced the Templar rule. No longer to fight in the open, but to observe, to preserve, to carry forward something forbidden but unforgotten. A Masonic lodge in Prague raided during the Habsburg purge of secret societies in 1621 was found to contain only a handful of documents, most benign. But among them was a single scrap of parchment, blank on one side and on the other, a wax seal pressed in black. No writing, no origin, only the mark. The inquisitors kept it. One suspects they did not understand what they had found, because the sigil was not a call to arms. It was a message to those who knew how to read it. A reminder that somewhere the order endured, that among the dust of relics and ruins, the true inheritance was not gold, but silence, ritual, memory wrapped in blood and wax. You can burn a flag, you can erase a name from history, but you cannot unseal what was never opened. For those who study the hidden alleys of history, there is a particular whisper that never fully dies, that the Templars were not only warriors and bankers, but custodians of forbidden knowledge. Not sorcery in the comic book sense, nor magic spells chanted beneath a full moon, but something subtler. Ritual, symbol. A way of seeing the world that challenged both church and crown. And among the Black Templars, this knowledge did not vanish, it deepened. Alchemy was never truly about gold. That was the distraction, the metaphor. Real alchemy concerned transformation of matter of the soul of power itself. To transmute base metal into gold was symbolic of a greater mystery, turning darkness into light, ignorance into understanding. And in the cryptic margins of history, the Black Templars seem to have taken this language seriously. One cannot speak of this without mentioning the so-called Gospel of the Furnace, a manuscript that surfaced briefly in the 17th century before vanishing again. Said to be written in Latin and Occitan, it bore no author and claimed no religious origin. Its pages described a black flame carried by those who had walked both the path of the sword and the silence of the tomb. It spoke of 7 seals of inversion stone within fire and the vow of the unbroken vessel. Historians dismissed it as Rosicrucian fantasy. But then came the discovery at Gisors, the same fortress long suspected of housing Templar secrets. In a sealed room beneath the chapel, excavators uncovered ritual tools, chalices, an iron compass, a bowl lined with traces of mercury, and on the wall a painted mural of a serpent swallowing its own tail, the Ouroboros encircling a flame. Black, unlit. Preserved in pigment older than the wall itself, the Church had long accused the Templars of heresy, of spitting on the cross, of worshipping idols like Baphomet. Most of it was political fiction. But within these accusations was a kernel of unease. The Templars had indeed encountered Eastern thought in Jerusalem, Antioch, and Acre. They had translated Arabic texts, shared secrets with Sufi mystics, and walked among Jewish Kabbalists. In doing so, they absorbed not just languages, but symbols, ideas, and perhaps alternatives. There's a recurring theme in heretical writings from the late 14th and 15th centuries, the flame that burns cold, the light that gives no heat, the ignis niger, the black fire. Scholars believe this was a metaphor for hidden wisdom, something that illuminated only those willing to accept contradiction. Fire but not fire, light but not visible, knowledge but not safe. Among Black Templar relics, one item recurs with eerie consistency: the iron lantern. Unlike the golden reliquaries of Catholic saints, these lanterns were austere, heavy, forged without ornament, They contained no candles. Instead, many held a small shard of obsidian or lead, dull, inert, and inexplicable. In Portugal, one such lantern was discovered in a sealed chamber of the Convent of Christ. Inside it was not light, but darkness. A hollow cavity lined with mirrored metal. It was by all accounts a vessel for shadow. The intention is unclear. Was it symbolic, was it functional, or was it something stranger, a tool for ritual or reflection? One theory suggests these lanterns were carried during midnight rites not to reveal the world, but to obscure it. A reminder that not all wisdom is seen. That some truths require blindness. At the heart of all this is transformation. The Black Templars no longer held lands or titles. They could not crusade or govern. What they could do, and perhaps chose to do, was preserve, convert the old power of the sword into a new kind of fire. Hidden, portable, unkillable. The term Vas Negredo appears in multiple coded letters from the Alps and Vosges. It translates roughly to the vessel of blackness, a known alchemical stage symbolizing decomposition, the death of the old self. But also, paradoxically, the beginning of change. In Templar-adjacent documents, Vas Negredo is always capitalized, treated not as a process, but a title. Perhaps even a person. Could it have referred to the Grand Master without a name or a rite performed by each initiate before assuming the mantle? The evidence is too thin to say for certain. But we do know this in every location linked to the Black Templars, the Iberian crypts, the Alpine tunnels, the Livonian paths. There are traces of fire without flame, lamps without fuel. Ritual tools blackened not by soot, but by time. It is no accident, no superstition. They were not conjurers. They were custodians, not of spells, but of the sacred refusal to forget. Even their enemies sensed it. In a letter recovered from the Vatican registry, one cardinal writes of a doctrine cloaked in smoke, preserved by those who kneel before no altar. He describes a fear not of rebellion, but of replacement, that the Black Templars were building not a church or an army, but a philosophy. One designed to outlast thrones, outlive papal bulls, and smolder quietly in the places where light is not welcome. Because the black flame was not meant to illuminate the world, it was meant to survive it. The letter arrived with no seal. Folded into 4 equal parts, wrapped in unmarked vellum, slipped under a scholar's door in the Old Town district of Prague. It bore no name, only a date, December 21st and 1421, and a location where the stars meet stone. To most, it would be nonsense. But to the man who received it, a professor of astronomy with ties to several reclusive orders, it was unmistakable. It was an invitation. The letter's recipient, whose personal journals were uncovered centuries later in a locked drawer of the Clementinum Library, described what followed as the most silent gathering I have ever witnessed, and the most awake I have ever felt. He arrived before midnight, as instructed, at the abandoned rotunda of St. Longinus, a Romanesque ruin forgotten even by the locals. Snow fell in gentle sheets, and the sky was clear. Inside, the scene was not theatrical. There were no chants, no incense, no thrones or garlands, just men 15 by his count, robed in black faces shadowed, standing in a circle around a single iron lantern that emitted no light. Each wore gloves not to guard against the cold, but to cover their rings. The observer wrote that the silence between them felt ritualized, not passive. Every breath was deliberate, every gesture encoded. At the center of the gathering lay an object on the stone floor, a map. Hand-drawn, lined with symbols the professor recognized from earlier encounters with Templar scrolls, compass roses without letters, stars aligned in unnatural configurations, and an inverted cross positioned beneath a seven-rayed sun. The lines between locations were curved, as if following not geography, but something deeper, ley lines perhaps, or memory. He was not spoken to directly. None of them introduced themselves. But one man, tall, motionless, at the eastern point of the circle, held a staff marked with a spiral of iron bands. At one point he stepped forward, pointed to the map, then touched his chest over the heart. No words, just motion. It was a language built over centuries, understood only by those who had watched empires fall and refused to speak of them. Outside, no one noticed. The city slept unaware that beneath its cobbled stones and gilded altars something older was still alive, convening not in rebellion but in continuity. We often think of Prague as a city of thresholds of alchemists, Kabbalists, astronomers, revolutionaries. But beneath that reputation lies a network of real walls, real tunnels, real histories, passed hand to hand through families that never sought attention. The Black Templars, if they truly gathered here, would not have done so to be seen. They would have done so to confirm, to reaffirm. Some modern historians have tried to dismiss the account as a fabrication, a fever dream written by an academic too deep in the occult. Yet curiously, the rotunda where the meeting supposedly took place was destroyed in a fire in 1422, barely 6 weeks later. Official records blame lightning, but there was no storm that night. What remained of the structure was razed within the year. No foundation stones were repurposed. The site was left empty until a post office was built on it in the 19th century, which promptly collapsed during construction. Legends, maybe, but legends don't explain the parchments. In 1994, a restorer working on the Clementinum ceiling uncovered a hollow between the rafters. Inside was a bundle of aged paper star charts diagrams, and one page marked Ordinem nonconformis iterum convocati, the non-compliant order called again. In the corner of that page was the symbol we now know all too well. The black cross, the coiled serpent, the flame. What were they meeting for? A renewal of vows, a handoff of knowledge, or simply a moment of reflection between centuries? Perhaps the key lies in the behavior. They were not strategizing, not plotting against kings. They were synchronizing, aligning maps, gestures, memory, making sure that scattered remnants across Europe still pulsed with the same rhythm. There is something sacred in that. Not in conquest, but in preservation. A kind of vow more enduring than any written word. The professor who bore witness called them a mirror held against time itself. And though he never saw them again, his final journal entry remains: they do not seek to rule. They do not seek to win. They seek only to remember what the world refuses to. Some men chart empires with ink and blood. Others use silence. In the dusty recesses of a library in Ravenna lies a map unlike any in the official cartographic records of the 15th century. Faded, drawn in careful ink on lambskin, it outlines the Mediterranean not in terms of coastlines or ports, but in symbols, stars, spirals, and a network of intersecting circles. It has no compass, rose no legend. But at its center, where Jerusalem should be, there is instead a single black flame. And in the bottom corner, the words, Custodes lucis vetustae, guardians of the ancient light. Its provenance was long unknown until marginal notes were discovered on an inventory slip, tucked into a folio from the same period. The handwriting was matched to a known scribe of the Order of Christ, the supposed successor to the Templars in Portugal. The note simply read, "Delivered by the riders of dusk. Held in trust for the next crossing." The next crossing. There have long been rumors that the Black Templars, or those who emerged from their shadow, preserved not just relics or rites, but maps. Maps unlike any sanctioned by the Crown or the Church. These were not maritime charts for trade nor pilgrim routes to holy sites. They were something else. Fragments, perhaps, of a broader design, a hidden geography, passed down by those who had seen more of the world than history admits. In 1482, a Florentine navigator named Tommaso Malaspina was arrested by papal authorities for possessing documents contrary to faith and doctrine. Among his possessions were 2 scrolls now lost, and a leather-bound folio containing a partial map of the North African coast, marked with a series of unfamiliar icons. What made the map extraordinary was not the land it showed, but the locations it omitted. No mention of major cities, no clear borders, and most curiously, a blank ocean marked with only 3 Latin words. Hic non est finis. Here is not the end. According to transcripts from his interrogation, Malaspina claimed the documents had been given to him by a knight of no name who bore the sign of the sleeping cross. He said the man told him the map was not to guide ships, but minds, that it represented the world behind the world. Naturally, the Inquisition called it heresy. He was never seen again. But pieces of the same iconography have since surfaced in chapel carvings, border illustrations in Bibles, even in the margins of alchemical treatises. The map was not a single artifact, it seems, but a distributed code, held not by one man or lodge, but by a network, custodians, carriers. There are whispers of such figures in several 15th century merchant letters, travelers in black, who came not to trade goods, but information. They would arrive by ship, unannounced pay in silver or services, and request only access to towers, bell towers, lighthouses, observatories. Places from which the stars could be seen clearly. One Sicilian notary wrote of a man who marked no cities, only alignments. He asked about eclipses, not tides. One might dismiss this as superstition, the flotsam of medieval esoterica. But in 2009, a French archivist discovered a folded parchment inside the false bottom of a 16th century globe, housed in the Château de Chambord. It bore a fragment of the same map style. And again, in the lower margin, the coiled cross, a black seal, faint from time but unmistakable. If this was a coordinated effort, it wasn't military. It was philosophical. The Black Templars, or whatever network grew from their silence, were not trying to redraw the world's borders. They were preserving knowledge that had no place within them. Knowledge that might have once belonged to Alexandria, to Petra, to Solomon's Temple. Or perhaps more simply to the spaces in between. In the Convent of Christ in Tomar, Portugal, one of the inner columns bears a curious carving long mistaken for decoration. It depicts a circle split by 7 lines, each ending in a different star. Recent analysis found these stars match the position of 7 known monastic sites across Europe that were once tied to the Templars. When mapped and connected, they form a pattern, not a cross, not a pentagram, but a spiral. It doesn't mark a destination. It marks a movement. The custodians of the map, if they existed, were not navigators in the ordinary sense. They weren't interested in territory. They were interested in connection, in resonance, in preserving paths that others had forgotten or had been forced to forget. And in a world that was increasingly bound by lines, flags, and cannonballs, these men carried curves. Buried beneath layers of dust and rumor behind a crumbling wall, in a disused Roman villa outside Frascati, restorers in 1911 uncovered a vault. It wasn't particularly deep. No obvious treasure waited within. Just a single shelf carved into the stone, and resting upon it a small black book, leather-bound, brittle, and utterly devoid of a title. No name on the spine. no author claimed. Only a sigil burned into the cover, a cross enclosed in a serpent, with the tail forming a spiral at its base. They called it the Roman Black Book, and for over a century its authenticity has been a matter of quiet debate among historians, theologians, and archivists, with more questions than public funding. The language inside is Latin but not ecclesiastical, terse, formulaic, as if meant for accountancy or military records. And that is precisely what the book appears to be, a ledger. Names, locations, payments. But the transactions listed do not match any known records of the Vatican, the Roman nobility, or the papal treasury. Instead, they are arranged by symbols. The cross of Lorraine, a coiled serpent, a crescent moon pierced with a sword. Each page lists exchanges of materials, iron, grain, wax, parchment, salt, along with notations like "for the vigil beneath the tower" or simply "in silence." One phrase appears with unsettling regularity: "Solutio pro tenebrae," payment for the darkness. Even more curious is the dating. The entries begin in 1321, nearly a decade after the official suppression of the Templar order, and continue until at least 1512. That's nearly 2 centuries of recorded activity, none of which aligns with recognized orders or institutions. And yet the regularity of the entries, the handwriting, and the accounting style suggest discipline, continuity. As if someone or some group had been maintaining a system the world no longer knew existed. Among the sites mentioned are familiar Templar-era strongholds: Tomar in Portugal, Gisors in France, Rosslyn in Scotland. But others are less expected: Petra, Rhodes, Thessaloniki. Places not typically associated with post-Templar survival, unless of course the order didn't dissolve, but rather scattered. And always the entries bear the same black seal. Sometimes drawn, sometimes pressed in ink. Never colored, never explained. One particularly fascinating entry refers to a transaction for the upkeep of the furnace. No further context is given. But in alchemical traditions, the furnace or athanor represents not merely heat, but transformation. The processing of base materials into something higher. Spiritually, philosophically, symbolically. Could this be another thread in the tapestry of the Black Flame? A few pages later, the same furnace entry appears again, only this time it's listed alongside what appears to be a name: Monsieur de El Anno, 1349. Historians have speculated this might refer to a known Templar survivor, a supposed descendant of Jacques de Molay. But no matching records exist. The initials, however, recur in later entries across the book, each time paired with similar phrases: the bearer of maps, he who does not burn, executor of silence. It begins to look less like a ledger and more like a chronicle, a record not just of movement and logistics, but of a long, quiet operation, sustained, hidden, intentional. The Vatican, when pressed, denies any knowledge of the book's origin. Some scholars suggest it is a forgery, a clever pastiche of conspiracy and medieval invention. And yet several pages contain ciphers identical to those found in verified Templar documents, seized during the original trials. The hand is steady, the ink consistent, the ritual language unmistakable. In the 1980s, a private Italian collector reportedly purchased a fragment torn from the book, a single leaf bearing only one line: "Nigrum est lumen quod non fallit." The black light does not deceive. That phrase, too, has surfaced before, etched into a silver ring found in a buried ossuary in the Jura Mountains. Engraved beneath the altar at a ruined chapel near Salamanca, inked into the edge of a map retrieved from the Knights of Christ in Portugal, and always accompanied by the Black Cross. The flame, the spiral, the Roman Black Book. Whatever it is was not written to be read aloud. It wasn't meant for believers or initiates or even scholars. It was operational, cold, meticulous, and above all, consistent. It does not preach. It records. And in doing so, it confirms what the more romantic theories have long whispered, that the Black Templars were not just hiding. They were organizing, funding, preserving their structure through trade, through coded transactions, through a ledger that never asked questions, only logged the silence. Perhaps the most chilling realization is this: the final entry in the book is dated 1512. But there is no concluding line, no summation, no benediction. Just a blank page, as if waiting for the next entry. If the Templars vanished from France, scattered across Iberia, and retreated into silence in the Alps, then where else might they have gone that no one would dare look? The answer, curiously, may lie in the very lands they once vowed to conquer. Ottoman records from the early 16th century, housed in the Topkapi Palace archives, include a set of curious military dispatches. These are not official communications between provinces or detailed maps of sieges. Rather, they're incident reports, field observations by Janissary commanders, noting irregular cavalry operating in border zones. The reports are consistent, heavily armed European horsemen, moving in small units, appearing during raids, and disappearing without a trace. They wore black. Their faces were covered, and none carried a banner. One entry from 1504 notes an encounter near the Dinaric Alps. A Turkish patrol stumbled upon what they thought were bandits, but as they approached, they realized the riders were not looting, they were guarding. One of the Janissaries was wounded in the brief clash and reported hearing the phrase, "Nulla retro est," there is no retreat. That phrase appears again a decade later in a Venetian report concerning mercenaries operating between Thessaloniki and Skopje. The report includes a sketch of a medallion worn by one of the riders, a 7-spoked star inside a black ring. It's easy to assume these were simple mercenaries, disaffected warriors for hire. The Ottoman Empire was vast and violent, and soldiers from all corners of Europe passed through its borders. But these riders were different. They refused payment. They spoke in Latin, and they fought with a style described as archaic yet disciplined. Ottoman scribes referred to them as Kara Hatzliler, the Black Crusaders. The very term drips with paradox. A crusader aiding no church, a knight owing no king. They weren't fighting for conquest or empire. In fact, they often fought against both. The most compelling reference comes from a captured letter written by an Ottoman administrator in Anatolia addressed to the court in Istanbul. The administrator, reporting disturbances in a mountain village, wrote, "There are foreign riders here, not Franks, not slaves. They speak to no one. But the villagers say they have been here before long ago in another time of fire. They say they come when old boundaries shift." This theme of recurrence of the same figures appearing across generations mirrors earlier accounts from the Alps, Livonia, and even Scotland. But the Ottomans were not particularly interested in mysticism. If they recorded these sightings, it was because they were real enough to matter. Further support comes from the rediscovered journal of a Venetian diplomat, Carlo Orsini, who traveled through Ottoman territory in 1511. In it, he writes, "In the hills west of Smyrna, I encountered a band of riders encamped beneath the ruins of a crusader fort. They wore black and bore no flags. But one of them, upon seeing my signet, approached and whispered, 'The temple is not dead. It has only turned.'" Orsini, shaken, fled the region within days. Skeptics might argue these sightings are fragments of local folklore, misunderstood vigilantes, or remnants of older European military orders fractured by exile. But then how does one explain the continuity of symbols? A Turkish coin hoard uncovered near Izmir in 2013 included oddly a single iron ring, not minted, not ornamental. It bore the same pattern found in Iberian Templar relics, a black cross embedded in a spiral. The iron was later tested and dated to the late 14th century. The style unmistakably Western European. The idea of Black Templars moving into Ottoman lands is deeply ironic given their origins as crusaders, but perhaps that irony was part of the appeal. In a world where kings betrayed them and the church burned them, the former enemy, brutal but unconcerned with papal edicts, may have offered a strange kind of freedom. There's also the possibility of alliance through necessity. Ottoman rulers were often pragmatic. If a group of disciplined warriors offered protection for trade routes, intelligence about European movements, or neutral mediation in volatile regions, they might have been tolerated, even used. One Ottoman document from 1522, dated just before the empire's assault on Rhodes, references a foreign unit aiding in the evacuation of civilians from contested territory. No uniforms. No names. Just the note: they came before the storm. They left before the fire. The phrase echoes others found in French and Portuguese accounts, the sense that these knights, if that's what they were, operated on the margins of catastrophe, never commanding, never overtly shaping events, but responding, preserving, observing, like sentinels watching not over kingdoms, but memories. And then there is the silence. After 1530, the references vanish, as if the writers knew they were being watched too closely. Or perhaps their purpose had shifted, fulfilled, moved again into the mist of history where their trail cannot be followed. But not all trails disappear. Some are simply hidden better, embedded in stones, passed in gestures, preserved in ledgers written in faded ink across borderlands no map remembers. If the Black Templars rode into Ottoman lands, they did so not as invaders, but as echoes. And echoes, if trained, do not vanish. They wait. It was just after dawn on October 4th, 1531, when a fire broke out in the lower quarters of a monastery perched along the Tagus River in Lisbon. The flames spread quickly, too quickly, according to those who survived. Within hours, most of the complex had been reduced to smoldering stone. The official cause was recorded as lightning. Witnesses, however, swore the skies were clear. The monastery, officially unremarkable, was under the quiet patronage of the Order of Christ, Portugal's own phoenix, born from the ashes of the Templars. Its records were minimal, its footprint modest. But what made this fire noteworthy wasn't its destruction. It was what was missing afterward. A vault. One that wasn't listed on any blueprint or monastic register. It wasn't in the sacristy or beneath the altar. It was deeper beneath the library, accessed by a spiral stairwell that no longer exists. According to a letter penned by an Augustinian monk named Pedro de Caldas, discovered centuries later, tucked into a missal at the Convent of Christ, the vault was known only to a handful of brothers. Pedro wrote, it held no gold, no relics, only pages, and the black flame. He never explained what the black flame was, but he spoke of books not bound in the style of the church, and scrolls with maps not drawn to lands, but to memory. Most chillingly, he mentions a symbol painted above the vault's entrance, a cross wrapped in a serpent, crowned with a circle of 7 points identical to the sigil found in the Roman Black Book, the Portuguese lanterns, and the mountain stones of the Vosges. The vault, according to Pedro, was empty when he returned after the fire. Not just destroyed, gone, as if cleared. The timing is suspicious. Just months earlier, tensions had been rising in Portugal. Rumors of a royal audit into the finances of the Order of Christ had begun to circulate. There was talk of increased scrutiny from Rome, of whispers about forgotten heresies hiding beneath the guise of charity and exploration. Some suspected that the fire wasn't lightning at all, that it was a purge. But a purge of what exactly? No one claimed ownership of the vault's contents. No one stepped forward to explain why a minor monastery had been entrusted with documents of such apparent value that they had to be hidden beneath stone behind sigils inside silence. The church remained mute. The Crown issued no investigation. It was as though everyone had agreed the vault had never existed. And yet, in the aftermath of the fire, survivors spoke of strange visitors. Men who arrived in the night before the blaze wearing black cloaks with no insignia. They claimed to be auditors from the order. One monk said they moved with the precision of soldiers. Another said they spoke only in Latin, but not the Latin of priests, clipped, formal, almost juridical. They left before dawn. The fire began hours later. Pedro's letter ends with a phrase that has haunted historians ever since: what was taken was not meant for our age. It was memory held until the next darkness. There is more. A ship docked in the port of Setúbal 3 days after the fire en route to Funchal in Madeira. Its captain, a Genoese merchant with no known ties to the order, reported taking on a private cargo from a group of monks who paid in silver marked with unfamiliar runes. The cargo manifest, preserved in Genoa's maritime archives, lists only sealed crates not to be opened. No recipient is named. No inspection was allowed. The ship departed under cover of night. That ship was later recorded off the coast of the Azores. Then silence. No further sightings, no shipwreck, no landing, only disappearance. What was in those crates? If the Black Templars had preserved knowledge, not relics or gold, but written memory, then this fire may have been the final act of transference, a controlled burn, a ritual disappearance. The physical vault removed, the monastery destroyed, the record erased all except the silence. Even today, the site where the monastery once stood remains undeveloped. A public park rests there now, its stone foundation buried unmarked. But locals tell stories of dreams, of hooded men, of burning stars, of voices speaking words that feel like remembering. The black flame, as a metaphor, had always pointed toward preservation, not of dogma, but of pattern, movement, thought. The vault, it seems, was not meant to last. It was a cocoon, a library meant only to be read once and then carried forward. And so it was, not by scribes, not by clergy, but by those who had long mastered the art of vanishing. If you find yourself in Lisbon, walk the banks of the Tagus near sunrise. Listen to the wind. It might not tell you a story, but it will remember one. It always begins with a handshake. Not just any handshake, a sequence of movements, fingers curled in specific positions, pressure held for a breath too long. The kind of gesture that means nothing to most, but everything to the initiated. And if the Black Templars had truly vanished into the folds of history, then this, the handshake, the symbols, the geometry might be where they left their last fingerprints, not in fortresses or scrolls, but within the body of a different order entirely. The connection between the Knights Templar and the Freemasons has been the subject of centuries of speculation, ranging from scholarly analysis to fevered conspiracy. But beneath the noise, a few pieces refuse to lie flat. One such piece is a manuscript discovered in Edinburgh in 1742, known among Masonic scholars as the Sinclair Scroll. At first glance, it appears to be a liturgical document, a genealogy of Masonic lodges and oath, a record of rites. But at its center is an image not easily explained, a hooded knight standing before a compass rose with 7 spokes surrounded by stars. In one hand, he holds a builder's square, in the other, a sword pointed downward. The figure bears no Masonic emblem, but across his breast is etched a small, dark cross wrapped in a coil. The Scottish Rite has always claimed a spiritual lineage to the Templars, citing Rosslyn Chapel as the point of origin. Indeed, Rosslyn's walls are covered in carvings that defy the period's orthodoxy maze before the America's musical cubes before notation. And within the crypt, hidden behind a fluted pillar, lies a forgotten carving, a serpent encircling a torch. Not a burning flame, but a cold one carved in deep blackened stone. More compelling still is a ritual preserved in the York Rite known as the Order of the Temple. In it, initiates are led through a symbolic trial of betrayal, burial, and resurrection, echoing the trials of Jacques de Molay, and culminating in the revelation of a hidden truth guarded by the Silent Ones. The ritual does not name the Black Templars, but its imagery cloaks without crests, broken swords, reforged light emerging from stone mirrors, phrases found in earlier Black Templar documents, including fragments from the Roman Black Book and the Livonian letters. Coincidence, perhaps. But there are those within Masonic history who claimed more. In a 1787 private letter between 2 lodge masters in Frankfurt, now preserved in a university archive, one writes, "The old watchmen do not sleep. They pass among us still, not as masters but as memory. They gave us the map. We build the hall." He includes with his letter a sketch of a ring, the same sigil we've seen before, the coiled cross, the 7-pointed star, the flame. You might recall that during the Lisbon fire, sealed crates were spirited away to unknown locations. Some theorists now argue that those crates contained not only manuscripts and maps, but objects, tools, blueprints, perhaps even foundational texts that would later be folded into the inner circles of emergent Freemasonry, coded, redacted, disguised in allegory. The question isn't whether the Freemasons were Templars reborn. They were not. The cultures are too different, the aims too distinct. But the question that remains and that flickers through centuries of symbolic echoes is whether a thread of Templar survival was woven into the earliest Masonic rituals. Not leadership, not conquest, but influence. Consider the prevalence of black robes in certain high-degree Masonic ceremonies. Consider the repeated use of the number 7 stars, 7 steps, 7 lights. Consider the emphasis on architecture as sacred expression, on geometry, as divine language ideas deeply rooted in Templar constructions, from Jerusalem to Tamar. A carved panel in a French lodge dating to the 1600s shows a knight standing at a window looking at the rising sun. On the windowsill lies a scroll, unfurled, blank. It bears no writing, only a symbol, one that you now recognize. Not because it was shouted through time, but because it was carried in handshakes, in stained glass, in floor patterns, in moments of silence during rituals that even the performers have forgotten the origins of. And perhaps that is the final victory of the Black Templars, not their gold, not their secrets, not their fleet, but their ability to encode themselves into continuity. To hide not in vaults or vaulting ambition, but in brotherhoods, in gestures, in ideas whispered in candlelight just before the initiation begins. They are not the Freemasons, but they are in the floor. Revolutions don't start with mobs, they start with murmurs. Paris, 1789. A city of powder kegs stacked atop printing presses, salons, and starving bellies. The old order was cracking the monarchy, blinking at the rising tide. But somewhere behind the guillotines and speeches, There were signs, faint, almost dismissible, that a much older current had begun to stir. In the weeks leading up to the storming of the Bastille, a pamphlet circulated in the poorer quarters of the city. It was unsigned, cheaply printed, its title blunt and ominous, De l'ordre caché, of the hidden order. The author, unnamed, wrote of an ancient brotherhood betrayed by kings reborn in silence. It contained no direct reference to the Templars, but its language was unmistakable. Phrases like the broken flame, the vow in darkness, and justice delayed, not denied. The church at this time was already on the defensive. Monasteries were being emptied. Nobility fled or were dragged through the streets, but within several confiscated estates, particularly those belonging to families long rumored to have Templar ancestry, curious artifacts were uncovered. Iron rings with black sigils, scrolls bound in ash-stained leather. One item catalogued briefly by a revolutionary archivist was a banner. Black, threadbare, but embroidered with a faded red cross, one not centered, but tilted as if in mourning. The archivist Claude Briand noted in his log, "This does not match known crusading emblems. It was found hidden behind a false wall in the estate of the Marquis de Valcourt." Alongside it, a sealed letter addressed to the Watchers of the Threshold. The letter's contents have never been published, but Brian's journals mention one phrase that appeared within: "The temple will not rise again in stone. It rises in flame, in thought, in fracture." What fracture, though? That question is answered at least partially in a private diary belonging to Maximilien Robespierre, discovered among his confiscated papers after his execution. In a cryptic entry dated mere weeks before the Reign of Terror began, he wrote, "They visited me in silence, black-robed, no threats, no pleas. Only this: the sword fell once in Paris. Let it not fall twice in darkness." Historians have dismissed this as metaphor, madness, perhaps hallucination under pressure. But Robespierre was not known for fantasy. He was precise, calculated, and that sentence, "the sword fell once," is a poetic reference to the Templars' persecution in 1307, in Paris, in the same streets now soaked with new blood. Coincidence, possibly. Except that in the archives of the National Assembly lies a document never entered into official debate, a proposal submitted anonymously during the early constitutional period. It argued for the creation of a secular brotherhood bound not by dogma but by memory, a guard against tyranny old and new. Attached was a sketch of a sigil, a cross, of course, but black, wrapped in a serpent, tipped with a flame. They called it a prank, burned the paper, but the image had already been seen. In the chaos of the Revolution, many groups claimed secret lineage: Jacobins, Freemasons, Enlightenment societies, but none moved with the silence and precision of the so-called Black observers, mentioned only in the letters of minor nobles attempting to flee Paris. They were described as well-dressed, hooded, appearing in jails and alleyways. One noblewoman, the Comtesse de Montaigne, wrote from exile, "They came to my cell before the mobs. They said only, 'You are not the one we seek.' And then they vanished." Who were they? Some say remnants of a failed revolutionary guard. Others, an early espionage circle. But a pattern emerges when you trace their path. They appear only near executions, tied to the old church, to the old temple, and always just before the blade. You may recall the vault destroyed in Lisbon in 1531. Pedro de Caldas had written, "It was memory held until the next darkness." Perhaps that darkness was not war or exile, but revolution. Because while kings fall and altars crack, ideas resurface, and those who guard them do not need armies. They need only time. Time to wait. Time to guide. Time to ensure that when the fire rises again, it rises in the right direction. There is even speculation, mostly whispered of course, that the Declaration of the Rights of Man itself bears hidden geometry borrowed from Templar architectural numerology. That the spiral of values, liberty, equality, fraternity, mimics the symbolic flame passed down by the Black Templars. Again, no proof, only rhythm. But perhaps that is what matters most. Rhythm, repetition, the quiet beat of a vow never rescinded. An oath not to a flag or a church, but to an idea. That power, when abused, must be watched. That memory, when erased, must be rewritten, not in stone, but in revolution. It is one of the darker ironies of history that the very regime which prided itself on progress and racial purity was so utterly bewitched by the medieval past. But among the various obsessions of the Third Reich Atlantis, the spear of destiny, the Ark of the Covenant, one thread runs colder than most: the persistent pursuit of the Black Templars. Himmler, the architect of the SS and high priest of Nazi occultism, was not merely a bureaucrat in black. He fancied himself a modern-day knight, a spiritual warrior waging an esoteric war beneath the surface of tanks and treaties. His Wewelsburg castle was to be the Grail stronghold of the new Reich, redesigned with ritual chambers, cryptic symbols, and a central hall of the supreme leaders, modeled after Arthurian legends, and possibly older blueprints. Within the archives of the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi Institute for Ancestral Research, a classified set of field reports detail multiple expeditions into southern France, northern Italy, and the highlands of Portugal. Ostensibly, they were searching for relics tied to the Holy Grail and early Aryan culture. But several of these reports carry a repeated notation: NBM Nigrum Bellatores, militia, the Latin phrase for Black Warrior Order. A recovered journal from one such expedition, led by SS officer Otto Rahn, hints at something deeper. Rahn, a Grail theorist and eccentric scholar, spent years among Cathar ruins and Templar ghost sites. In a 1938 entry, he scrawled, "They are not gone. They have simply changed garments. The mantle is now shadow, but the cross still burns. We are not the first to search. We are not even the closest." 3 months later, Rahn was dead. Officially, suicide in the Alps. Unofficially, silenced. There's a reason Rahn had become a liability. He had begun suggesting that the Black Templars still existed, not merely as a mythic thread in European folklore, but as an organized hidden entity that operated entirely outside of nation, race, or ideology. In short, they could not be controlled. And nothing enraged the Nazis more than power they could not command. Yet the Ahnenerbe files did not stop. A dossier found in the Soviet-captured Berlin archives includes a disturbing detail. In 1942, a Templar seal, black cross serpent entwined, was allegedly found embedded in the stone floor of a bombed-out church in Avignon. Beneath it, a vault, empty, scraped clean. The date of its clearing just weeks before the German advance reached the town. And it wasn't just Himmler who was captivated. Hitler, in his private conversations compiled in the so-called table talks, made vague references to an ancient European core, hidden under centuries of rot. He likened the SS not to modern armies, but to the knights who watch from the dark. It's tempting to wave all this away as delusion. The Nazis were prone to myth-making. But one curious pattern remains in the final days of the war, when Berlin was burning and the regime collapsing. A sealed train was sent south, destination unknown. Soviet intelligence claimed it carried art. American files list gold. But one OSS agent stationed in Lisbon at the time wrote in a confidential cable rumor spreading in Vatican channels that the train carried not treasure but testimony. Proof of an order continuing from the ashes. What kind of proof, no one knows. The train disappeared. Like so many other things tied to the Black Templars, its trail stops, just short of revelation. You may remember the encoded rituals referenced in Freemason records, or the fragment of the world map supposedly carried by a black-cloaked envoy into Florence. Those were artifacts of preservation. But the Nazis were seeking activation, the spark, to wield that ancient knowledge for domination. They failed, or perhaps were denied. Because for all their rituals and relics, the Black Templars appear to hold to one central tenet: secrecy above supremacy, memory above manipulation. One might wonder then, were they watching the Third Reich not to join it, but to ensure it passed? This theory gains traction when you examine the pattern of sabotage among certain Nazi projects. Ciphers failed inexplicably. Archaeological sites were compromised from within. Trusted officers suddenly vanished or were discredited, often after veering too close to Templar-connected regions. A few scattered names appear again and again in these incidents. Minor, unremarkable, low-rank men, never caught, never found. Always near black-marked documents or intercepted orders referencing ancient lineages. Perhaps it's nothing. Coincidence. Or perhaps these anonymous actors were something else entirely. Custodians not of relics, but of boundaries. Ensuring that power once betrayed would not be betrayed again. You may think of the Lisbon fire, the map, the letter to Robespierre, all moments where the Black Templars seemed to intervene, not to rule, but to redirect. And perhaps in the flickering twilight of the 20th century's darkest chapter, they did so once more, silently, without banners, cloaked not in steel but in shadow. It was supposed to be a quiet place, a tiny hilltop village in southern France with more sheep than people. Rennes-le-Château had long faded into the landscape, a forgotten speck among the green ridges and crumbling chapels of the Languedoc. And yet, since the late 19th century, this sleepy commune had drawn treasure hunters, mystics, and the occasional priest with a penchant for sudden wealth. You know how that story goes: a village pastor uncovers something, renovates the church with opulent flair, and then dies under curious circumstances. Whispers of a hidden vault, a heretical gospel, or perhaps a buried truth. But the real break in the tale didn't come until 1972. That spring, local authorities responded to an anonymous tip, a warning that someone was conducting illegal excavation beneath the old Tour Magdala, the peculiar neo-Gothic tower built by the famously enriched priest Béranger Saunière. What they expected to find were amateur treasure diggers. What they actually found was something else. According to the now classified report, later leaked in fragments to a French journalist, officers arrived at dawn. The scene was still, the air damp with dew and the distant clatter of goat bells echoing down the hill. As they approached the tower, they saw fresh earth, a broken padlock, and something that made one officer drop his flashlight: a figure robed in black, standing still as a statue by the exposed stonework. The figure didn't speak, didn't flee, just stared, face covered by a hood, hands gloved. And then, in one impossibly fluid motion, it turned and vanished into the trees behind the estate. No footsteps, no trail, nothing. Inside the site, they found a narrow shaft dug into the floor with rusted tools, a recently burned lantern, and something stranger still, a fragment of parchment sealed with red wax, marked by a sigil. A black cross flared at the edges, and a serpent twisted along its spine. The seal matched one previously logged by Vatican investigators in 1923, the same found in Avignon. It was listed in the registry of unauthorized nightly cults and tagged with the now familiar abbreviation NM Nigrum Militum. Further investigation uncovered that the excavation was not the work of looters. Sophisticated diagrams were drawn into the soil. They followed ancient Merovingian alignments connecting the Magdalene altar to the distant mountain ranges. It wasn't a treasure hunt. It was a ritual map. The locals, when questioned, claimed to have seen nothing unusual. But one old shepherd spoke quietly of La Sentinelle Noire, the Black Sentinel who had been seen once before, years earlier, during another mysterious dig involving foreign men with shiny boots. Speculation ran wild in the fringe historical circles. Some claimed the figure was a guardian of the tomb, perhaps even of Mary Magdalene herself. Others thought it was a dramatized hoax, a staged distraction to keep investigators from something deeper. But for those who had followed the trail of the Black Templars, the implications were chillingly familiar. What stood out most in the Rennes-le-Château report was not the sighting, the seal, or even the excavation pattern. It was a note scribbled in the margin of the final page by one of the responding officers, a phrase that seemed both confused and reverent. He moved like he had done this before, centuries ago. It calls to mind earlier episodes: the Venetian grandmaster without a name, the Ottoman mercenary with Latin vows, the black-cloaked envoy in Portugal, all described with that same aura of timelessness, as if they weren't just inheritors of a tradition, but continuations of a presence that never left. And what was Rennes-le-Château really, if not a crossroad of mysteries, the perfect place for one more thread to emerge from the shadows? The tower, the map, the altered geometry of the site, all echoed patterns found in earlier Templar commanderies. The use of the number 8, the emphasis on sunrise alignments, the serpent motif. You might recall the Prague gathering in 1421, a midnight conclave of independent knights declared loyal to no crown. Or the secret vault cleared just before the Nazi occupation of Avignon. The Black Templars had left footprints before, and each time they appeared, they vanished just as quickly, erasing themselves with surgical precision. Except here in Rennes, someone seemed to have wanted the mark left behind, as if it was time for the myth to surface again, just a little. And that raises a troubling question. Why then, why 1972? Some believe the timing was tied to the Cold War, that Western intelligence agencies were hunting esoteric artifacts as part of psychological warfare programs. Others suggest it was a warning, a message from the Shadow Order to those getting too close. Or perhaps after centuries of silence it was a simple nod, a whisper from the margins that said, "We are still here." The parchment fragment was never released publicly. The police denied the incident. But decades later, a retired officer dying in a Marseille hospital allegedly told his son there was a man beneath that hood, but he was no man. When asked what he meant, the old man closed his eyes and whispered, "He carried the silence of 1,000 lives," and looked at me like I was a child. Sleepy village, strange tower, old legends. Perhaps it's all just stories. But if you ever visit Rennes-le-Château and find yourself walking past the tower at dawn, don't be surprised if you feel eyes watching you from the trees. Not hostile, just waiting. You've walked a long, winding trail by now, across shattered monasteries, lost maps, and flickering apparitions that seem to vanish the moment you try to focus. The story has taken you through the ashes of crusades and the echoes of revolutions, but one question still pulses beneath it all. Like a slow drumbeat, could they still exist? Not as metaphor, not as legend, but as a real, structured living order. It's easy to dismiss a handful of scattered sightings or cryptic sigils as coincidence, to file away the idea of the Black Templars under the same label as flying saucers and alchemical conspiracies. But that's not what this is. This is a theory chilling in its simplicity, maddening in its implications, that the order never died. That what the world witnessed in 1314 was not destruction, but retreat. Let's follow it from the beginning. The official suppression of the Knights Templar in 1312 was not a military defeat. There was no great battlefield, no last stand. It was a legal maneuver, a coordinated political strike between Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V. The order was accused, arrested, tortured, and scattered, but not extinguished. That's what makes it so unusual. Most orders ended in blood. The Templars ended in paper. And yet their assets, vast, complex, well-managed, didn't simply disappear. While some were seized by the crown or absorbed into rival institutions, many were never properly accounted for. Dozens of commanderies went dark. Templar fleets vanished. And across Europe, certain properties remained curiously unclaimed for decades, still managed by quiet men in black habits, fluent in Latin, quick to show a cross. Just not the one Rome preferred. Now recall the Order of Christ in Portugal, openly formed from former Templars under royal protection. They kept the same rules, the same prayers, the same initiation symbols. Their Grand Master's seal remained virtually unchanged. And even more fascinating, this new order became one of the principal navigators of the Age of Discovery. It was they who placed the Templar cross on the sails of ships bound for lands no Christian had ever seen. That alone could be interpreted as a resurrection, a sanctioned rebirth. But what if it was only the visible half? The deeper theory, the one whispered in Masonic lodges and scribbled in the margins of forbidden books, is that while the world watched the Order of Christ sail into sunlight, another branch took to the shadows. One that refused to wear the white mantle ever again. One that chose exile not as a defeat, but as camouflage. The Black Templars, if you will. This lineage would have no official name, no registry, no pope to approve its rules. It would be a phantom structure built on memory and oath, passed down through encrypted letters and private rites. It wouldn't need cathedrals, only quiet places, forests, ruins, forgotten priories, and when it acted, it would act subtly. Not with armies, but influence. Not with swords, but survival. Take a moment to reconsider some of the more troubling clues, the Livonian letters encrypted by Teutonic scribes, but referencing brothers of the flame whose allegiance lay elsewhere. Or the black-robed envoy in Ottoman records, who could translate Latin, Greek, and Hebrew fluently, but bore no standard and refused to name his patron. Or the Freemasonic diagrams that mirror pre-1312 Templar architecture so precisely that some scholars believe they were copied, not remembered. And what of that unsettling consistency, the seal, the cross, the black cloak reappearing across centuries, in places disconnected by geography, but curiously aligned by intent? What if those weren't isolated echoes? There is a possibility, and here's where the theory becomes harder to ignore, that all of these sightings were not mistakes. They were strategic appearances. Reminders, like the shadow of a clock hand passing over the same point every few generations, marking the passage of a hidden cycle. And if you look at the pattern, a chilling rhythm begins to emerge. The Black Templars are spotted most often during periods of disruption. The fall of monarchies, the rise of new faiths, the collapse of empires. It's as if they surface not to intervene, but to observe, to bear witness to moments when the world cracks and to take note of what bleeds through. Some believe they are guardians, others that they are the very engineers of collapse. But the truth may be stranger still. They could simply be continuity made flesh, an oath that outlived its altar, a mission that outlasted its map. And perhaps the most haunting part of this theory isn't that they exist, but that they've been waiting. Watching the world spiral forward in chaos, choosing not to act until the conditions are just right. Waiting for what exactly? That's the open question. Some say they're waiting for a return of the temple, a literal rebuilding of Solomon's house. Others claim they await a sign, a prophecy tied to bloodlines and relics long since buried. And then there are those who suggest something darker, that the Black Templars are not a brotherhood of redemption, but of reckoning. The last remnant of a lost covenant, no longer sworn to the church or the crown, but only to themselves. And so we find ourselves staring not into the past, but into the present. If the theory is true, if this shadow lineage is real, then they are not relics. They are contemporaries. And they are still here, still watching. They say the past is gone, sealed away in dust and parchment, that its ghosts are quiet, its secrets buried. But sometimes, if you're paying attention, if you listen not for what's said, but for what's missing, you'll feel something else. Not memory, not history, but presence, watching, unblinking. You've come far, across scorched battlefields and hidden crypts, through archives stained with ink and blood. The Black Templars, formless at first, grew clearer with every step, not just a scattered legend, but a lineage, a system, an idea that refused to die. And now, with the trail closing around you, a thought lingers. What if you were never following them? What if they were leading you, the lights dim now, candles low, your thoughts heavy? Somewhere far from cities, deep within old forests or beneath ancient stone, a door may still open only to those who know the signs. Men in black may still kneel, not in worship, but in silence, bound not to flag or faith, but to memory. Their armor is gone, but their eyes remain, watching, always watching, and perhaps, just perhaps, they've already seen you. Sleep well.